how is Governor DeSantis' relationship with Anthony Fauci? Are they like, do they go to dinner together? Do they text each other? Do they play Scrabble? I'm just curious.
You've got to be kidding. So he has said that Fauci has been the most destructive influence on our country throughout the pandemic, frankly. And actually, about a week ago, it's funny you should ask, because a week ago, his campaign, DeSantis' campaign, released, they put out merchandise all the time that you can buy to support the campaign. They released a pair of flip-flops that are Fauci flip-flops, because he flip-flops on so many things. And then, like, he had...
That's not a new thing. The flip-flops have been out there. I think George Bush almost got hit by a flip-flop at one point.
Yeah, but you can see them, and so they're pretty fun. Yeah. And then, like, earlier this summer, he had a beer koozie that said, "Don't Fauci my Florida." Mm-hmm. So there you go. So it says pound sand Fauci. Like, so you could see that... I wouldn't say they have a good relationship, but why should they? Because Fauci has been fighting Florida every step of the way. He was against reopening. He was against opening beaches, and we know beaches are not dangerous in terms of COVID spread.
Let me ask you: if DeSantis was president today, like maybe you guys have had the discussion, he's a strong leader. How would he have handled Fauci? You know, he said something. One of the comments I'll read about what he said about. He said it's on page 6. Let me read this to you, and then I'll go to the Fauci side, where he said, DeSantis regrets not speaking out much louder against Trump's recommendation to stay home. This is a CNN story. Florida Governor DeSantis said one of the biggest regrets in office was not speaking out much louder in March 2020 when former President Donald Trump advised the nation to stay home to slow the fast spread of coronavirus. DeSantis blamed people like Anthony Fauci for advising Trump to consider a shutdown. Fauci, the country's top infectious disease expert, was part of the coronavirus response team that was led by Vice President Mike Pence and included other public health experts, but the decision was Trump's to make, and DeSantis ultimately followed the White House lead, closing Florida schools, governing government buildings, gyms, bars, and restaurant dining rooms, and advising Floridians to stay home. So that's a direct shot at Trump and Fauci. But if Governor DeSantis was the president today, if he was, how do you think he would have handled Fauci? What would that relationship with Fauci be? Would he have been fired? What would he have done with Fauci? I'm curious.
Well, you know, hindsight is always 2020. So if we were looking back at March 2020, April 2020, during the very beginning of COVID, when nobody really knew what this virus would do, or we didn't have any information about it, of course, a lot of politicians, Governor DeSantis included, they made policies out of an abundance of caution, I think. But I think what DeSantis has done, which is unique for a politician to do, is he looked back on what happened in April and the stay-at-home order for that month, and he said that was a mistake. If I had known then what I know now about COVID and about how it spreads and about the risks, I would not have issued that order. We would not have closed anything. It's so rare to hear a politician just admit that. And so DeSantis has ruled out any future lockdowns. Even when we had a case surge recently, it's going down now, but we did have a surge with Omicron like every state had.
Yep.
And, you know, that was never on the radar, the idea of closing things. As far as your question about Fauci in particular, well, I want to back up. The interview that you're referring to where he mentioned Fauci, and, you know, CNN framed it as though it was an attack on Trump. It wasn't. He didn't mention Trump. He mentioned Fauci by name. And he clearly, if you listen to the context of that interview on the Ruthless podcast, he clearly put the blame on Fauci for this idea that lockdowns would work to control the spread. And, you know, I think though, let's say, you know, one day Governor DeSantis is president and Fauci is still around. And again, like I said, I don't know what he's going to do, but
Fauci would be 83, just so you know.
I mean, he seems
if DeSantis was president, he would be 83.
He seems like he's still pretty energetic and obviously has a huge role in the Biden administration, a very negative role, but he has a lot of power. So seems to, you know, as old as he is, he's still sharp. I would say as a civil servant, you're limited in terms of what you can do in terms of firing civil servants. But I think there's a way to do, because Fauci lied to Congress. We know that, like, he testified to Congress something that wasn't true. So that is a legal reason to remove him from his position. If it were March 2020, before all of that happened, before the congressional testimony, before any of this, and you see that Fauci is an activist, and he screwed up, I mean, earlier with the AIDS crisis when HIV first started. Like, he had a long history of basically failures. And so if you know that and you want to sideline him, you can sideline him give him something to do that has nothing to do with the COVID response, and work with people like Scott Atlas, Jay Bhattacharya, and these different doctors who kind of are looking at the evidence and have different ideas, you know? And so I think Trump did, when he was president, he did actually try to seek out those views, but he was really being pushed from all sides, whether from Fauci, Birx, from the press, from Biden, from so many people, you know, basically blaming him unfairly, I believe, for all the COVID deaths that happened under his presidency. Now we see Biden's presidency, we've seen more people die than died under Trump. Nobody blames Biden directly for that, and I don't believe they should, because I don't believe that it's any president's fault. Maybe the president of China, I mean, if we want to blame somebody. But like, you know, I think I wouldn't say that anyone would get everything right. Nobody's gotten everything right throughout the entire pandemic, but I do think Governor DeSantis' approach is to look at the data, see what it's showing him, and make a decision based off of that.
If question for you, you said hindsight is 2020. I think we can all agree that, you know, March of 20, you know, March, April, that first initial wave when we didn't know what the hell was going on, people are wearing masks for the first time ever. There's a different perspective now. You know, hindsight is 2020. So I think I'll just read you a quote, but it's basically, I'll just summarize it. It's not just a health crisis. We're also dealing with an economic crisis, businesses shutting down, physical health crisis, mental health crisis. We're talking about like that. Like there's a famous quote that war is too important to be left to just the generals. So essentially, you know, this pandemic is too important to be left to just the scientists, the Faucis of the world. So you need businessmen and operators and entrepreneurs who are saying, well, yeah, I get it. Shutting down might, you know, stop the spread, but what happens to all these businesses? What happens to people sitting at home, you know, not exercising, not getting out? So essentially, ultimately, my question is, if you can summarize DeSantis' view of how to handle COVID in as few words as possible, what would that be?
Keep people informed about the realities, about what the data says, and let them make their own decisions and respect those. I think you made a great point. I think, you know, there was tunnel vision in this country, still is to some extent in some places, where people would just listen to Fauci or whichever of the doctors is on CNN is saying that we need to do this and that. But they're not taking into account the other effects. About the economy, it's tied to health, right? If you lose your job, if you lose your business, your health deteriorates because of that. Maybe not directly, but indirectly. It's stress. Crazy. It's mental health. Kids who were locked out of school for a year and a half are now in places like California. They're now seeing spikes in psychiatric inpatient treatment for kids, which is so sad because kids are not at high risk, you know, of the virus, but they are at high risk of depression. They are at high risk of suicide. Even like it's so terrible that we didn't, like, a lot of the scientific community, mostly led by Fauci, didn't really take this into account. They're focused on just COVID. They don't think of the other health risks that are tied to the economy, that are tied to keeping things open and living a normal life. And so I think it's all about balance. And Governor DeSantis believes that as well. Balancing all these different concerns, economic and health-wise, to keep society functioning and doing the least amount of damage.
So if you enjoyed this little short segment from the podcast that we did, here's another short segment to watch. Or if you want to see the entire podcast, click over here. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.